I'll ask all of you to kindly rise up to your feet so that we can say the opening prayer and start. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for a bright new day. We are asking, O Lord Almighty, for open minds so that new ideas can flow in to build us up, to enrich our knowledge, and to make us more purposeful and meaningful towards our profession and in our various fields of endeavor. We give you praise and thanks that you have heard us, even as we have prayed in your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, our chairman for this morning's occasion is no stranger to us. We know him very well because he's a member and his profile is already featured in the brochure. He's the managing partner of Deloitte, and he's also a professional accountant and has been in the profession for a very long time. He's very seasoned, very well-traveled, and very experienced. And we are sure that he's going to steer affairs very well the whole of today to ensure that we have a successful conference. So I'd like you to join me with a welcome applause to invite Mr. Nana Abekansaki to take over the seat of this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, you are all welcome. I believe today is going to be a good day. Speakers for the day are very seasoned people, and what I would entreat all of us to do is to take out our pads and pens and jot down the issues that they are going to talk about so that when it comes to the deliberations, we can all participate in full. I will straight away move on to the program, and then we can do the introduction of the speakers, and then we take it from there. You are welcome again. Thank you.
Our speaker for this morning is an executive director of the Center for Policy Analysis. Somebody said he heard him on radio yesterday talking about some economic issues, I'm sure. And CEPA is an independent, non-governmental think tank which provides analysis and perspectives on economic policy issues of Ghana and the developing world. Our speaker this morning is going to give us an enlightening discussion, delivery on promoting sustainable economic growth in ECOWAS. And I believe that he has all the knowledge and the capability to handle that topic. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the podium Dr. Abbey.
Good morning. Good morning. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the executive of the association or the institute. Sometimes even a notable talkative like myself can be humbled by these introductions. I think we must have a new charter to just let people speak and let the public judge whether they've discharged their responsibility. Your theme, Mr. Chairman, is most appropriate, is the headline news all over the world, how to promote growth with stability, and the experiences in the Eurozone, but not exclusive to the Eurozone, should remind us about the importance of making sure that the economic growth objective is not easily sacrificed. If you can see advanced countries in the Eurozone struggling about austerity and how to put growth in, as also happened in the French elections, you find that the topic of sustainable growth and stability is an important thing that should engage the attention of all professionals, indeed of all the people that are stakeholders in economies. The specific theme that I've been giving is promoting sustainable growth, economic growth in ECOWAS. Mr. Chairman, the sources and drivers of growth are not uniformly distributed across economies or countries, nor are all countries at the same stage of development. If you look at our sub-region ECOWAS, you find that you have about 3 categories of countries. On the one hand, you have about 12 out of the 15 or so countries or economies in ECOWAS that are classified among the least developed. And because of this, for example, in terms of international trade relations, they are able to access a facility called Everything But Arms into Europe. They don't face any tariff barriers whatsoever. The only thing is that they are not allowed to export freely arms, but they don't produce any anyway. Then you have Nigeria. And Nigeria is the dominant, the economy of Nigeria is the dominant one in our sub-region, by some estimate accounting for about 70% of total ECOWAS GDP. And then behind Nigeria, and Nigeria is a big oil producer, of course, behind Nigeria you have Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. And this heterogeneity makes common policy making and planning rather very difficult. To be sustainable, economic growth must be equitable and inclusive, and it must create jobs and broaden opportunities for participation. And so when you have a heterogeneous collection of countries, it can be very difficult to be able to come up with the types of policies that would live up to the aspirations of the people involved. Promoting economic growth in ECOWAS, therefore, will require support for the very concept of regional integration in a slightly more concrete and meaningful way than has been the case thus far. It will also require infrastructure development. It will also require private sector development. It finally requires a commitment to good governance. African governments since independence have embraced regional integration as an important component of their development strategies. The strong support for regional integration in Africa is evidenced by the large number of regional integration arrangements that have been concluded, many of which have significant membership overlap. It was recognized that the fragmented nature of the African continent makes integration a sensible solution to the low and slow growth that Africa faces. Because most African countries have small populations and low per capita incomes, their domestic markets are rather small. Combined with high production costs and deficient investment, this would result in very little foreign direct investment on the continent. Regional integration creates larger markets, or at least has a potential to do so, that allow for the exploitation of economies of scale, increased competitiveness, and greater inflows of direct foreign investment. I must say that the emphasis should be that it is not an automatic thing that regional integration would promote increased competitiveness. In fact, the challenge for Ghana and Africa generally is how to make our enterprises internationally competitive. Without integration, African countries risk remaining in the world economy as producers of primary commodities and importers of manufactured goods. Promoting regional integration could accelerate overall growth rates and leave poorer areas better placed to benefit from growth in the trading hubs. Integration can also help African countries diversify their economies and build up protection against external shocks while increasing efficiency and productivity. It could also provide a platform for increased domestic and regional resource mobilization for investment needs and resilience against potential shortages of foreign direct investment. Regional growth, however, Mr. Chairman, has been limited by cumbersome regulations, poor fiscal and legal coordination, and poor infrastructure, and the prevailing lack of resource and production complementarities between the countries involved. The experience shows the difficulty of making progress when we look at the record of trying to agree on convergence criteria to enable the adoption of a common currency. Infrastructure is an area in which Africa is particularly vulnerable. Due to low domestic savings and high investment needs, Africa is faced with large resource gaps. Now, this is something that is unfortunately true for most of our African countries. Unlike the Asians, for example, we have very low domestic or national savings rates. And this is something that is rather worrisome. It is not true that it's because we are poor. At the heart of it, it looks like a matter of our own faith in ourselves and in our tomorrow. If you have a tendency to feel that your life is precarious, it becomes very difficult to save. And yet, in Asia in particular, you can see that high savings rates are still possible. Now, when you have low savings rates, and yet huge infrastructural needs, particularly to develop your human resource base, you are stuck with a situation of how to procure resources to fill this huge savings investment gap on terms that are consistent with growth and stability, macroeconomic stability. And that is what we must keep focusing our minds on, because it is this gap which has led to our becoming so aid dependent. As we get to a situation in which, thanks to rebasing of our national income, we now are told that we are lower middle income countries, it means that the aid industry is going to collapse. Because now you have both a moral and an economic reason for aid to Africa, aid to Ghana, to be harder in terms of the terms than ever before. And then for Ghana, on top of it, you have the promise of oil. So we should know that we cannot anymore be able to fill this gap between our savings and our infrastructural or capital needs through soft loans. Now, this means that we must be even more vigilant about the efficiency with which we use resources. You cannot keep blowing up your infrastructural requirements for reasons of politics and then borrow to fill in that gap. That becomes unsustainable. We all need to be really very, very vigilant in making sure that we get value for money, that the investments we make, particularly in our human resources, that these investments are payable in terms of enhancing growth for the generation of the resources that will enable us, not on welfare grounds, but on participatory grounds, to deal with poverty. If we don't generate the resources, it's all talk about being able to alleviate poverty. We cannot take our poor to the kitchens of other people. So we've got to grow, and that's why growth is important. Investment is critical to growth, and if you blow up the cost of investment, you cannot sustain growth. So we have left the area in which we can be playing around with contractors having bloated contracts, not fulfilling the terms of the contract, and Ghana just paying for it. We can't. It's not sustainable. And so this is an area that we must focus. We cannot economize in this regard on our human resource building, because an educated, therefore trainable, therefore employable, healthy population can overcome even some of the fiscal impediments on the way. It's our people that will take us there. So we cannot economize on our human resource development. And we should not be just mechanistic about it. If we train people who are not employable, they will just remain charges on the state. So this area of focusing sharply, bringing all the skills to make sure that we account for the resources that we are able to procure, our own and borrowed funds. The largest gaps that we seem to have in the fiscal infrastructure area is energy. The modern economy is driven by energy. There's an economist who has said that you can judge the level of civilization or modernity of countries by how much they rely or how less they rely on human brain power or even animal power and use energy from energy producing facilities. So it is important that we recognize that increasingly modern growth requires energy. And this is where the energy gap is important. Once upon a time, we had enough energy produced in Ghana to spare, and we could even join in and export energy. Today, we have very serious gaps. We are told that the Ghanaian economy's energy requirements grow at about 10% a year. Now, that in itself says that we are not using our energy efficiently, because if you have an economy growing at currently maybe a little over 8%, non-oil sector growing at about 8%, and yet you are demanding energy growth, production growing at 10%, you've got to check again. But then we are also told that we lose about 20% of the energy produced in Ghana in transmission losses. That is not tolerable. That is not acceptable. We cannot generate the energy and then lose it all. That energy is a deadweight burden on costs in the economy. This leaves us, instead of trying to bring down the cost of production, to try to subsidize. Now, the subsidy then must be paid for, and people then begin to quarrel about it. If you read the latest report, we are being called upon to look at energy subsidies. Large resource gaps also have implications for access to finance. This is because where resources may be available, they often do not reach businesses, especially startups and SMEs. In Ghana, and as indeed elsewhere, the SMEs need a lot of help. If we do not grow our SMEs properly, we'll be stuck with joblessness. The current situation in Ghana, which unfortunately I was reading a couple of days ago, that has become an Africa-wide phenomenon of jobless growth. But the key to jobless growth, or the reason for jobless growth in Ghana and elsewhere, is inadequate development of the SME sector. And so we need to do everything. I did pick up, I don't know whether it's your organization or not, that there is a project to try and improve transparency in the dealings of SMEs, that they need help. A lot of people have these things in which they don't realize that to access funds, you need more transparency than we seem to have. The SMEs are seen by a lot of bankers as highly risky. And a lot of the reason they look so risky is because they are not transparent. And it is important that they are helped to know that borrowing and so on require a measure of trust. If people don't believe that you can repay your loans, who should lend to you? So it is important that we do everything we can to make sure that we draw our SMEs from the shades of the informal sector into the light, and let them know that it is in their own interest. We cannot just put political pressure on banks to lend. It doesn't work. So it is important that we look at the development of our SMEs, because they are the backbone for job creation in Ghana and in the ECOWAS. Private sector development. There's a lot of lip service. This is our problem. We seem to know what we want, but we are very poor at determining the pathway or the instruments to achieve our objectives. You read plans, whether in Ghana or in ECOWAS or Africa as a whole, and we're very clear about where we want to be. but we don't know which vehicle to take. We know very well we want to go to Kumasi, but we don't know which vehicle goes there. And therefore we stuck at the lorry park or wherever we choose to assemble. We've got to come up with instruments. We must always insist on having clear-cut instruments that at least have the potential of taking us where we want to go to. Listing all the things about fast growth, regional integration, and so on, and asking yourself, but how are we going to reach our destination? Is theory. It's just, that's how many plans remain unimplemented, because we are long on our goals and objectives and very short on how. How are we going to get there? How are we going to alleviate poverty? How are we going to generate growth? If we see the problems in Europe, you should tell us that it's not a peculiarly African thing. It is a very important thing. I think that based on your theme, the follow-up should be to see, so how do we actually generate growth and make sure that it's a type of growth that will come with jobs? Because if you don't have jobs, then the feeling of increasing poverty will remain with us. If you see a family that has sacrificed a great deal for the education of the children, these 18 to 25-year-olds, by the time that they come home from their training and find that they don't find jobs, become even more difficult for families to bear. So it is important that the youth, and it could be a wasted period of youth, and when people begin to survive without having to be productively engaged, it's very difficult for them to go back. So it is important that we lose no time whatsoever in making sure that the youth take the discipline of education, where you just make yourself available to be taunted by teachers and punished for not doing your homework and so on. That discipline is what they need to take into employment. If you have too long, if you take any long distance runner and they stop the running and sit down, getting up again could be very difficult. Let's not waste our youth. Human resource development is important. Investment in education is important, provided we ensure that it will yield returns. That is what the problem is. You cannot just say you're educating people when they end up being unemployed. So we need to make sure that we get things right. And that is what brings us to the importance of good governance. And after a long period in which the framework for international cooperation ran under a banner of non-interference in the internal affairs of countries, which also meant that Africa has kept a lot of bad governance on our books because we don't even talk to each other, partly because perhaps we all are carrying our little things on our backs. So we are not able to talk and advise each other at the governmental level that what you're doing is not sustainable. Now the world has moved on, and democracy is a big banner. And it is proving a destabilizing thing because our mindsets are still to protect dictators and autocratic regimes. So you find a big conflict between the goal of democracy and the goal of good economic management. And this is one of the things that many Ghanaians, unfortunately, are not discussing seriously, because it's been noted that in the Fourth Republic, which also ushered in democracy as a main thing when we transited from PNDC rule to the Fourth Republican constitutional rule, we find that it's been a lot more difficult to manage. Ghanaians don't maybe realize that in 1990 and 1991, Ghana actually recorded fiscal surpluses, not deficits, fiscal surpluses. And there was talk about whether Ghana was going to graduate from IMF tutelage. Since then, Ghana has been born into the Fourth Republic, has been one in which we've been having deficits that are difficult to manage. And moreover, it has been found that every election year shows up as one of excessive spending. Excessive spending in both the public and private domains. Large loans are taken by individuals from the banking system, not to invest in their businesses, but to support their political parties. The war chest is being built for the elections, and you find huge amounts of money being put together to support campaign rallies where huge numbers will be bussed from all parts of the country by all the political parties to show how popular they are. And of course, these people will be fed, they will be refreshed, and they may even get some out-of-pocket allowances. Now, that may be tough enough, but like celebrations, they are also costly, and they put pressure on the supply side. And if we do, since the economy cannot just automatically respond to these huge demand pressures, then you have to start bringing in imports. These two forces then create tendencies for inflation to rise and for the currency to come under depreciating pressure. Now, this is what we are going through again. In year 2000, because of these types of political forces, the cedi lost half of its value in 1 year. The cedi started year 2000, at 3,500 old cedis. By the end of the year, it was trading at 7,000 old cedis. This same phenomenon, to a slightly lesser extent, was repeated in 2008. And even though Ghanaians still dispute the outcomes, the reality is there. From about the middle of 2008 to the middle of 2009, the cedi was continually depreciating and inflation was on the rise. And this is what forced Ghana, the new government, to move from whatever plans were in the budget of 2009 and accept, however gradually, a stabilization program, 3-year stabilization program with the IMF, which is what we are still running. And the consequences of a stabilization program has been delayed completion of investment projects, accumulation of payment arrears, which sometimes backed off into the banking system, raising the stock of non-performing loans, which reached over 20% in February 2010. And these bad loans in the banking system have been responsible for the high lending rates, particularly to the SMEs. So if we do not curb the spending, excessive spending, then we'll be in trouble. And that is what we are going through right now. The speculation on the cedi is essentially the market factoring in the potential or the threat of excessive spending, both by the private sector and the public sector. That is what investments are running away from. They believe that the excessive spending in Ghana in election years will lead to a cheapening of the value of the cedi. So I tell people that there's nothing mysterious about the rise in inflation or depreciation. It's because we are on a spending binge. And this is what we are being told by the IMF, that we're going to have to curb the spending. Now, that becomes a national issue, because you can't have a situation in which the political process is full of a bidding war between political parties as to who will spend more. If we don't curb it and make a serious, credible national response that we are aware of the consequences of our way of politicking, then the cedi, no matter what the Bank of Ghana does, and it has pumped a lot of money, foreign exchange, into the system to help prop the cedi, but we don't have the resources that we can keep just supplying more and more foreign exchange into the system. I mean, you ended the year 2011 with a record $5.4 billion equivalent of international reserves. But in January alone, you lost $800 million of that. So you can't just go on supplying. The reality becomes that when the speculators realize that you are running out of the foreign exchange to pour into the system, then the thing takes on a life of its own. So it's up to Ghanaians to rise up to the challenge and in a non-partisan way come together and make a commitment that we will try to be fiscally disciplined. It is not something that should be left to one party and suffer the consequences. If we do that, it won't happen, and the cedi will fall. Don't ask me to what, I don't know. What I know is that it will fall. The development of ECOWAS as an effective instrument for accelerated growth and development will require a commitment to mutually advantageous arrangements directed to the substantial reduction of tariffs and perhaps even more importantly, non-tariff barriers. There's too much talk about the difficulties of doing business in West Africa. People talk about the road barriers, roadblocks where extortion takes place in full glare. Nobody seems to worry about it. All these types of things, whether they are bribes paid to local or ECOWAS member state officials or not, will show up in the cost of the goods that are being transported. And they make the goods that we transport uncompetitive when we arrive at our destinations. So we cannot say we are committed to building ECOWAS into an instrument for growth in the sub-region if we also don't realize that we are piling up by these barriers and the bribes and the stoppages and so on. If we do not see that that is not the way you build an effective ECOWAS, then we are wasting our time. It becomes just talk. So it is important that we just don't make the political commitment, but that we back it up with enforceable rules of behavior. The reality also must be faced that in life, there are quite often resistances to exports of others or what will become the imports. And these are not purely material. Sometimes there are feelings of patriotism that make people not willing to buy other people's production. So it is important that we take these happenings seriously and see how we can overcome them. Successful integration, therefore, is seen as requiring both enhanced market access in the advanced countries. Unfortunately, that is a problem we are faced with now, that under existing rules, integration into the world economy is seen as a prerequisite for growth. And yet, the record shows that we are turning things upside down. Trade should be an instrument, not an end in itself. And therefore, when we have, as in negotiations with the EPA, trade taking the center stage and market access and the rules of the WTO go against privileged access to markets based on ill-defined criteria. For example, we all know that at the end of 2007, the Lomé-Cotonou Convention was getting to a close. And the Europeans came around with this EPA, which was to suggest that under WTO rules, the only way that countries, former colonies, the ACP states, could continue to have access, privileged access to European markets will be if we have reciprocity, which is one of the things of the WTO. Therefore, it required that we also open our markets to them. Of course, it serves their interests that this should be done. Particularly, competing blocs will find that if we have the EPA and therefore open to markets to Europe, then the Europeans will have an advantage over others. So there was a lot of resistance to this being done. Besides, if you're going to focus on trade, to make trade a developmental instrument, then there are all manner of things that will have to also be done. And therefore, you can find that without you having prepared for that type of integration, then trade could impose costs that are rather unfortunate. Among other things, for example, if you lower your tariffs to be able to achieve this reciprocity, if you lower your tariff barriers and other non-tariff barriers, then you will find that the fiscal people will be upset with you because there will be a loss of revenue. And because of this, you could find that there's resistance because your deficit could widen unless you have also tax reform to make up for the lost revenue from import duties. You may also find that because you have not prepared, and this is what is even more critical, because you have not prepared your enterprises to stand up against the challenge of imports, then some of them may fold up with consequences for jobs. So you find that organized labor quite often is opposed to these types of trade arrangements. But the critical thing that one wants to emphasize is that the problem is with the path we have followed so far, in which competitiveness, international competitiveness, has not been squarely put on our development agenda. And part of it is because we all jumped in with a number of newly independent countries to follow an import substitution industrialization policy. Now, the problem with that is that you did not start off basing your industrialization on improved processing and turning domestic produce into storable forms or new products that can be with us. If you think back, even in times gone by, you recognize how initiative got put into this type of process to stretch the harvest across to the next harvest. You got things like sun drying of cassava. Now, that was a way of making sure that you can still have a form of fufu that you don't call fufu when the fresh cassava is no more available. We had things like sorting things and baking things and storing in that type of way. These were the embryonic forms of manufacturing activity. When we started with the import substitution industrialization, we went to the import list and selected items for domestic production. And the only criterion was that they required very little management skills and low levels of technology. When we did this, it meant we did not care sufficiently about how we're going to keep on supplying the inputs into the production process. Well, because maybe we had cocoa and gold and other minerals and timber and so on, we didn't worry about the fact that one day you may find that you don't have the foreign exchange to keep on bringing the imported inputs, and then what happens to the enterprises. We also did not worry about the need for these enterprises to be competitive, because we gave the market to them by sheltering them behind high tariff and non-tariff barriers. So then one day again, you find that you don't have enterprises that can stand up to competition, and then you have a problem. So it is important that we take the issue about how do we grow a competitive private sector to take up the development challenges. And that is what we need, not only in Ghana, but throughout the ECOWAS sub-region. I think whatever we do, whether it is human resource development, whether it is infrastructure, whatever we do, we must be doing these things with a view to making the cost of doing business in Ghana low. And for that reason, the cost of doing business in ECOWAS low. It is costs that we must be managing. The training of our people to be knowledgeable so that they can be employed to work up the technology ladder is a cost-reducing, a productivity-enhancing, cost-reducing enterprise. So competitiveness must be on the choice of roads, must not be politically driven, must be economically driven. We must choose roads and bridges that open up the economy and make sure that we reduce the cost of doing business. That must be the challenge in front of us. And building the institutions to make sure that we are able to have a truly competitive, vibrant private sector is what should be in front of us as we seek to develop growth and development. I thank you very much.
That was very deep, very, very deep and very educative. Thank you very much, Dr. Abe. At the appropriate time, we'll have a question and answer session. And so we'll invite our second speaker to present on behalf of Dr. Jonathan Aremu. The Chief Executive will do the introduction.
Well, Doctor, I would like to thank you for your presentation. I think Doctor needs one round of applause. He gave a very insightful presentation. I mean, you could see that we were making a presentation without necessarily written on the paper. That tells you that it's a guru when it comes to the economy. And no government, as far as I'm concerned, no government can ignore him. The NDC, MPP, we have to consult him before we can give any establish sound economic policies. So, Doctor, thank you. Next year, you are going to TASA. Next year, you are going to have second African Congress of Accountants here in Ghana. So at least we are going to have about 1,500 accountants gathering here. There's no way we can ignore you, so kindly prepare for that. That'll be just a minute. Well, I'm happy to announce to you that we have a guest from Nigeria, ECOWAS, to be precise, ECOWAS Commission. I have the honor to introduce Mr. Edwin Daniels. Edwin Daniels is a deputy to Dr. Jonathan Aremu, and he is a trade and development consultant with Market Links Group. That is the consultants group for the ECOWAS Commission. Without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Daniel, Mr. Daniel, to begin the presentation.
I work as a deputy in the Market Links Group. We are a trade and development consulting firm supporting major international organizations in doing trade and investment research in the whole of West Africa. Today, the original plan was to discuss the paper presented by Dr. Abe. I want to say that it is extensive. In fact, for what I'm going to present now, it's just going to capture almost the same thing that Dr. Abe has talked about, but I'm sure yesterday some of the things that were discussed include the steps of regional integration. While Dr. Abe has, gotten deep into the crux, I'd like to just today state that I will be talking more on the issue of regional integration as a process. Now, I want to say that there are several dimensions to promoting sustainable economic growth in West Africa. But the most important part that I want to talk about today really has to do with the dimension. Without much ado, I'd like to just make some quick reference to Africa's economic outlook. We are totally aware of this. Dr. Abe has given us a lot to chew on that in that regard. But let's look at it. African economies are characterized by weak agricultural growth, a decline in industrial production, poor export performance, debt accumulation, and a deterioration of social services, institutions, and of course the environment. In sub-Saharan Africa, the average economic growth is 3.4%, barely above the rate of population growth. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the expenditures devoted to social services have greatly diminished. The level of education is dropping, and infant mortality remains high. The most dramatic consequence of this economic crisis is the growth of poverty. The poor spend almost 80% of their revenue on food. I'm sure you will all notice this, at the expense of savings, education, and health, as a result of increases in food prices having serious negative impact on the standard of living of the poorest people. What I want to emphasize here, Dr. Abe has aptly described, if the prices of food is so high and we all have to spend almost everything we earn on trying to survive, on trying to eat, what is left? How do you mobilize savings when nothing is left? What do you save? And this is very critical because without savings mobilization, there will be, serious consequences for investment. And if you can't invest in infrastructure, in all the things that we need, the pillars, how do you hope to sustain economic growth? Or how do you hope to have economic growth? So these are the that's the situation we find in Africa today. So the need for new strategic thinking, it's very critical that we change our thinking in Africa. Africa risks a tragic future if new strategies and concrete, sustainable actions are not immediately put in place. For the next years, Africa must strengthen its human resources. Like I said, I will be repeating many of the things that Dr. Abe has already said, but putting a regional dimension to this. Africa must strengthen its human resources, make them employable, make them productive. It is not enough to go to schools, but it is more important that people are trained, to add value to the economy, trained to add value to the society in a way that they are relevant. Training should not be based on ideologies, but should be based on relevance. That's the point Dr. Abbey has made already, so I won't stop there. Develop institutions and agriculture in order to increase revenues as well as food security. Protect the environment and then promote small enterprises. If somebody sees this paper, it will look as if Dr. Aremu and Dr. Abbey actually sat down, to put these papers together. It's very interesting as he was speaking because the same concepts are just reverberating. It is clear that economic growth for the region is the key to higher living standards. But, he has also raised, fragmented economic units in Africa has been seen to be one major obstacle to achieving the common objective of economic growth. Thus, the need for regional economic integration. The ECOWAS consideration. Economic integration comprises legal arrangements among nations for economic transactions and activities across national boundaries. Regional integration is a type of economic integration in which a set of nations within a certain region form preferential arrangements, typically on international trade. If you look at the ECOWAS regional integration model, you will understand that since 28th of May 1975, the main treaty that is driving this process provides for several things. One, eliminate between member states custom duties and other charges of equivalent effects on import and exports. Eliminate quantitative and administrative restrictions on trade among members. Establish a common external tariff structure and commercial policy towards non-member countries. ECOWAS, then another objective is to eliminate obstacles restricting the free movement of persons, services, and capital between member states. Harmonize agricultural policies and promote common projects in the member states, notably in the field of marketing agro-industrial enterprises. Implement schemes for the joint development of transport, communication, energy, and other infrastructure facilities, as well as the evolution of a common policy in these fields. Harmonize economic and industrial policies of member states and eliminate disparities in the level of development of member states. Harmonize monetary policies of member states. Establish a fund for cooperation, compensation, and development. And of course, embark on other activities in the interest of the member states within the community. Those were the objectives. But you see, this is very, very ambitious. The model is so ambitious in ECOWAS. I'd like to look at this. I'm sure maybe yesterday, I don't know, they talked about these dimensions of regional integration. I will go quickly through them so that we will see at what stage ECOWAS currently is. Because the regional integration has been seen as a tool, like Dr. Abbey said, as a tool for economic growth within the region because of all the advantages that comes from regional, for having a bigger regional economy than single fragmented units in the region. The very first dimension is PTA, a preferential trade arrangement. This has been on, we can see the main characteristic here is to promote provision of merely lower barriers among participating nations. Non-members face higher levels of barriers to trade. It is the loosest form of economic integration. The example can be seen with the British Common Preference Scheme established in 1932, basically because the British saw that Germany was going at a faster rate, and they needed to, create a system where the British, the British Empire and all their dominions and all their all the territories, come together, having a simpler, trade, reducing the trade barriers between them. What today you will call the Commonwealth of Nations. All the nations in Africa, the Canada, and all of them that have been territories of the British administration before, coming together to say, let us lower our tariff system. That was the earliest form we saw. The next one will be the free trade area. That's another dimension. Here, all barriers to trade are removed among members. Each member retains its own barriers to trade with non-members. There is need for rule of origin to protect deflection possibilities from non-members. An example is the EFTA, the European Free Trade Area. Another is the NAFTA. And then, of course, today, ECOWAS ETLS is in place. I'm sure we all know that. Every good produced within the ECOWAS sub-region is supposed to go duty-free, quota-free within the region. But that really is in theory, because there are all kinds of administrative barriers that does not allow the free flow of this kind of policy, even when it has been signed by the heads of governments of ECOWAS. The next stage you will see is the customs union. In the customs union, we're not supposed to have no tariff or other barriers on contracting members. There is supposed to be the common external tariff on the rest of the world by custom members. CET is accepted, is usually the lowest pre-union rate. Then, of course, we should be harmonizing all our non-tariff barriers under the custom union. And then this is a difficult task in ECOWAS today. The EU has formed this since 1957. Today, under the EPAs, we're supposed to have one coming with ECOWAS. Okay, thank you. So, but the challenge again is there has been difficulty for ECOWAS to really harmonize what you call the common external tariff. We are aware, like in Nigeria, for instance, there was a major argument on what we call the fifth band of 35%, whereas the rest of West Africa wanted 4 bands, particularly the French-speaking West Africa, wanted only 4 bands to end at 20%. But Nigeria insists that we have some burgeoning industries that we cannot afford to come to take just the 4th band of 20%. All this kind of policy divergence have resulted in some difficulty in implementing the ECOWAS common external tariff. But that is still work in progress. The next stage after the customs union is supposed to be the common market. Of course, it's supposed to have all the same characteristics of the customs union. It's supposed to permit the mobility of factors. It's supposed to have no invisible trade restrictions. When I say invisible, not necessarily just when we agree on paper. It's supposed to be in paper and in spirit. So anybody from one of the member nations can easily move factor mobility. Investment can move across the region. Nobody is interested in if you're coming from Nigeria or Ghana or Togo or Benin. An ECOWAS factor is an ECOWAS factor. That is supposed to be the case. We're supposed to harmonize trading standards and practices, even for service provision, like the accounting procedure, as we have the chartered accountants of Ghana and that of Nigeria, it's not supposed to make any difference. It is supposed to be common. So it is supposed to be that service provision in Ghana and service provision in Nigeria is the same. Standards are practiced the same. Everything is supposed to be harmonized. But I'm sure you will know, you can attest that is not exactly the case today. We are trying to get there. The EU achieved this. The EU, that is the epitome of regional integration in the world, achieved this only in 1993. And then, of course, the last stage is the economic union, which we all are aspiring to have. You see, the reason why this is important for us is that, as highlighted by Dr. Abe and this paper, it is an instrument for economic growth, sustainable economic growth. If you create a large market and you benefit from the economies of scale, it is a lot easier to achieve poverty alleviation at the micro level, because there is a regional market available. There is a regional pool of fund available for investment. There are all other advantages of being big. It then translates. It is supposed to translate, to the standard of living of the citizen, ECOWAS citizens, wherever they are located. In Ghana, in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Benin, anywhere. That is what it's supposed to be. But with all these advantages, we've seen that it is a difficult task to achieve. The only case we can see right now in the world where this has actually happened is the United States of America, which is actually right now one country. Now, I don't know if this table is really visible. We can see some characteristics, as I've highlighted, in terms of the dimension of economic integration. For the free trade area, the only meeting is just the free trade between member states. Yes, the rest is no. Okay, for the customs union, yes, in terms of free trade between member states and then common external tariff. The rest is no, and the same way like that. But when you come to the economic and monetary union, everything is supposed to be the same, including central economic policy, central that. But now in West Africa, it is good to understand here while the ambition is while the idea of the founding members of ECOWAS is very ambitious, the model really is supposed to be the ideal. If you see all the objectives I read earlier, many of them fall into the several categories. So it is the intention of the founders of ECOWAS that we come to an economic union. That is the whole point, economic and monetary union. That was the intention, but is that the case? Of course, no. So that's why I'm going to talk about why some integrations do not work, the ECOWAS case. We may not be able to talk about that in detail. This paper will be available. I'm sure you can read through all of this eventually. But it is important to understand the failure to implement reduction in trade barriers among themselves and common external barriers among non-members. It is good to have it in paper, but it is more important to implement them. In fact, the major crisis in the ECOWAS integration process is the issue of implementation. We can agree at the supranational level. We can agree the head of state can ratify a convention and a treaty. The ministers can ratify. But when it comes to implementation, member states still go back and do what they have to do. Largely because, as highlighted by Dr. Abe, the different level of development in the member states, the disparity is so much. You have Nigeria on one hand, you have Togo on another hand. Different levels of development, different levels of industrial development, different levels of service development, different levels of financial development, financial sector development. And as such, when we come together and agree, it is more when we go back to the country, realities in the country does not allow us to implement even what we have agreed upon. For instance, I can tell you right now in Ghana, right now in ECOWAS, we have what we call the Common Investment Code, or the Common Investment Market, that has been developed, adopted already by the heads of government. But here you still have the Nigeria Investment Promotion Council having its own investment policy. Ghana Investment Promotion Commission, or I don't know what the name is here, having its own investment policy. One critical case that has been the case, especially between Nigeria and Ghana, is the issue of domestic retail trade. It has been said here, and which is very correct, because that is the reality in Ghana, is that you do not leave retail trade to foreigners. That should be the preserve of Ghanaians. Very good. That is the reality here. But at the regional level, different thing has been agreed upon. So that becomes a serious issue for discussion. So I will quickly skip through all of this, because several of the things, most of the realities we've done here is key. Now, if we have all of these difficulties, there is high degree of uneven economic development. Like I said, in the region, only 3 countries are non-LDCs: Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. The rest are LDCs. Some of them cannot even finance their budgets. They will depend on aid to finance their national budget. So how do you want to do regional integration when some people can't even finance their budget? So they expect assistance. And are the regional heavyweights, are they ready to drag these very low ones alongside when they're coming, when the regional heavyweights are also struggling economically with all kinds of issues, including governance structures? Despite the shortcomings of ECOWAS, the establishment of ECOWAS is put in place to improve the efficiency of local industries within the region via heightened competitiveness. Dr. Abe mentioned this already. During the import substitution strategy, many times our local and domestic industries are protected. But we still need to see that we are not just in Ghana, not just in Nigeria. We have a global space today, and the issue of globalization has made the reality very different. You cannot continue to do, because right there on your laptop, on your tablet, you see high value products available elsewhere. When you can't find them in Nigeria or in Ghana or anywhere else in West Africa, at the click of a button you have ordered, it will come by DHL. That is true. You just need to, once you pay, it will arrive here. And so because of this regional, the globalization and the space that we can't control, the ECOWAS region cannot control that. Technology has made the world a global village. You will still need to consolidate so that there will be enhanced competitiveness. Because people, when they have a choice, they will go for value for money. That is the reality. So we still need to do this regional integration. So the economic union is still important for us to have the reality of insurance against policy reversals. Today we can agree to do something. We can make a policy statement today as a nation, but tomorrow, for political reasons, we can reverse our policies, and investments are affected. But when we're working within a regional framework, it might be difficult to reverse such policy statements. So there are still several other reasons why. For instance, in the WTO, all kinds of things all the rules that have been set forth within the regional space, we can have more realistic rules set for ourselves. It becomes a common negotiating position at such multilateral platforms where we can all speak with one voice. So there is still a need for regional integration. Whether we like it or not, if we continue to remain fragmented, the idea of economic growth is not sustainable. And as such, we should look at how to harness harness the gains of regional economic integration. Now let me talk quickly about the sustainable development angle. Sustainable in the sense of continuous growth, and sustainable in the sense of using the benefits of today to deprive the generations of the future. Because many times today, if we know in the region, in ECOWAS particularly, the basis of resource mobilization has been the exploitation of the natural endowments, the solid minerals, gold, oil in Nigeria, forestry and agriculture. We are exploiting nature to do this. But if we want to increase our standards of living and increase our welfare by harnessing the resources of today that nature has given to us, we should understand that it has implications for the future. So what we should be looking at today will be how can we harness these resources without jeopardizing access or these resources for the future generations. So the issue of sustainable development comes into play. Transforming ecosystems through economic development has yielded net benefits to human society. But continuing to achieve these gains by degrading nature risks irreversible declines in productivity and producing an inverse relationship between resource exploitation and poverty alleviation. In terms of ECOWAS, unmitigated loss of nature, accelerated by population growth, will lead to ecosystem change at a scale and breadth too costly to reverse, and particularly when one adds climate change predictions to the current scenario. We must guard against losing the true meaning and concepts of sustainability. And as such, even when we are increasing our access to all the resources that nature has given to us, we should understand that there is a future that we must arrive at. And that future, if we are not careful, we can lose that. What are the policy options for us in the ECOWAS, in the integration process? ECOWAS still has the ability to advance its sustainable development ambitions. In order to achieve this, however, policymakers in the region need to take into account the following issues. 1, balancing the desire of the grouping to adopt the principle of open regionalism on one hand and the imperative to lift millions out of poverty on the other. And in doing this, several issues have been highlighted by Dr. Abe, which I think are, we do not need to overflog. Nationally, institutions have to be strengthened. Regionally, we have to be open. We have to be transparent, and we have to be committed. Providing the necessary political and economic commitments to the full implementation of various socio-economic initiatives, such as a social safety net to minimize the impact of economic globalization and regionalization. Basically, if you know you're going to regionalize, you're going to be part of a regional economic union, and there are realities locally, what we should be looking at, what we call adjustment costs. Is it better for me as Ghana to adopt this investment policy when I know my citizens will suffer in this way? If they will suffer, what is the cost? So what you call the cost-benefit analysis is supposed to be carried out by member states. And when you see that the benefit outweighs the cost, you start providing for what you call social safety nets for those who will be marginalized in the process of regionalization or regional integration. so that when you make such provisions, it's a lot easier to implement regional strategies that has been agreed upon at the local level. I've mentioned, recognizing the importance of marginalized economic groups, just like what we're talking about in the economic policy making process. I want to, I will take this last slide. Encouraging greater economic solidarity and the pursuance of common regional policies and positions at wider multilateral forums. We've talked about that earlier. Now, I want to say this here. This is very key for me because widening the consultation stroke policy making process, this is critical. Critical in the sense that right now there are significant improvements in the quantity of engagement, especially at the ECOWAS level, between policymakers and regional stakeholders. The quality of such interactions can still be improved and expanded to include higher level participation by civil society organizations and professional bodies as well as the private sectors. I'd like to dwell on this briefly because it is very key. I was talking to Mr. Sante last night and I was saying that in Nigeria we're trying to, within the implementation of the WAMS, the West African Monetary Zone, it was in the timetable we are supposed to enlighten or sensitize the private sector in the plans for monetary union, at least among the what you call the eco zone. And when the private sector people were called together, these are the big weights in the private sector in Nigeria. And when the presenter started talking about all the benefits of monetary union and all that, and where we are right now in ECOWAS, and the participant just simply said, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, all this is big grammar to us. How does this help me do business? Break it down. How does it help me increase my market? How does this help me increase employment? How does it help me increase? That is what we want to hear. But when you are doing consultation at such technical experts level, and people have come to bring papers and submit papers and, all kinds of things have happened. At the end of the day, the people who are going to implement, the economic actors, the real sector, are not really carried along. When they hear these stories, it is very strange to them. And when they suddenly see that Nigeria is going to change to the ECO in 2020, are you serious? What do you mean? And all these kind of questions begin to... So it is important to bring in more people. What I would say is community-based organizations, professional bodies, the accountants, for instance. How involved are they? Professionally, the lawyers, the consulting engineers. How involved are they when you're thinking of regional infrastructure? Sorry to say this, most of the times the consultants come from Europe. And you can understand why. Because most of the studies are funded by EU funds. And so when they are funded by EU funds, the consultants will come from Europe to ask the questions. And they will apply policies for you. So what we are saying right now is that there is a greater need right now to involve people, professionals, locally, economic actors locally, so that by the time decisions are reached, the reality on the ground are reflected in these policies. On a final note, I'd like to say it is very important to provide for more legal structures. This is critical. I was talking to Mr. Sante last night because whatever you agree upon, there is no enforcement mechanism. Once you've agreed, it has been agreed, we all go home. We get back to our countries and we do what we like. There is no enforcement mechanism for all the policy convergence that has happened. The ECOWAS Court of Justice or the Community Court of Justice is based in Abuja. There is none of their decisions that has been enforced nationally. When the decisions are made, when the judgment is given, so what? Just what Dr. Abe said, how do you enforce when there is non-interference agreement? How do you enforce such things? But for the regional group like the Euro, once anything has been agreed on by a referendum or by whatever means, and it has been agreed by the European Parliament, it becomes binding on member nations. It is enforceable. But that doesn't exist today. And as such, it becomes difficult indeed to agree on very beautiful ideas at the government level, intergovernmental level, but when they cannot be implemented, when they cannot be enforced, it becomes difficult to implement. So, using economic integration as a basis for sustainable economic growth in the region becomes a mirage. I'd like to conclude quickly by saying that after all said and done, it is left to the citizens to actually make these things work. If the institutions, if the governance structure of our national governments are not working, it is left to the citizens to hold the government responsible. If the structures in ECOWAS is not working, it is left to the citizens to make these structures, the governance structures responsible. It is our duty to make sure that sustainable economic policies and growth is sustained by holding our political structure accountable to us. And we can only do this when we provide empiric evidence for why things are going bad, just as Dr. Abe has put it. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are at the question and answer session. And so if you have any questions, comments, and sentiments, this is the point at which you may express it.
Regional integration seems to be a catalog of failures. From listening to you and Dr. Abiy and listening to our speakers yesterday, we find out that when it comes to free trade, it's a flop. Customs union, a flop. Common market, a flop. Economic union, a flop. Political union, a flop. Then these facts are also aggravated by the fact that the three most important variables that are the causal factors that underpin development has also been mismanaged. I'm talking about inflation, government revenue, government expenditure. All the things that you follow in 2007 in Kenya, all the institutions were there. ECOWAS was there, World Bank was there, NEPA was there, United Nations, they were there. And they came out with some key messages, the same messages that we are coming up today. So one, the private sector has a critical role to play in promoting regional integration. This is Dr. Abiy says. Two, it is important to adopt a grassroots approach to promote the ownership of regional integration. This is Dr. Daniel said. Three, we need to increase capacity of the ECOWAS group. Four, need for a more participatory institutional architecture. Five, upgrade the quality of technical and scientific education in primary and secondary school. Six, we need to fill the infrastructure gap. Seven, we need to take charge of the development agenda. Eight, we need to gain access to global market. And nine, we need to create a stable, peaceful climate in the region. All these are the challenges you have enumerated them. Last night I chanced upon the anthem of the ECOWAS, and I felt very sad. But these are lessons. It says, peace and unity and social justice everywhere. Cultural integration and liberty we declare. Women and youth all shall maintain our future bright. In health, human and natural resources shall sustain our world. This is so sad. What I want to ask, what can we do practically so that this talk stop, so we walk the talk to be able to integrate? Since we are saying it is important that we integrate. Thank you.
I'm really enlightened because for a long time I've been wondering why cost of production is so high, even though various governments, are doing all they can to lower, cost of production in terms of cost of energy, labor, and all the factors of production. But today I've been enlightened that the bribes, the corruption is what's caused, is the main cause of a high cost of production. But my question to Dr. Abiy, I have read that in the Asian countries, various governments put in deliberate policy to induce savings. However, in Ghana, it's sad, about 2 years ago, I had some money from a niece who wanted to do some savings in Ghana. She happened to stay abroad. And I went to one of the banks to ask of the rate, 1% for the whole year. Meanwhile, at the same time, cost of interest was just around 23, and savings interest was 1%. I don't know what policies governments are putting in place, but what can they do? You are the director for policy, Center for Policy Analysis. What advice will you give government of Ghana, and for that matter, West African, because it's the same. Doc just mentioned that 80% of our earnings go into food, education, health. Even education, basic education is free. Only food. I thought I saw education there. Only food. So what can government do? What can they do to, do savings? Because without savings, we'll be where we are. Thank you.
Well, I think that we are moving to where we take responsibility for ourselves. I think that for me is the main thing. Let me start with the last part. A number of people would say that the reason that we have such a low savings rate in the country would start from the fact that food alone takes virtually all of our income. Well, but I'm also saying to you that there are countries of the same level of incomes, average incomes as we are, that save more. So what is it that we are saying? I think that for me, the factor of do you see an extension of yourself into tomorrow, or do you see just darkness in front of you? If you see an extension of yourself tomorrow, you will find that you need to ask yourself, so how am I going to live tomorrow? So it comes to whatever sacrifice you make in terms of consuming, let's say, less of your income today, even if it means that you reduce yourself to have a need. The question becomes, what do you do? Where is the vehicle that you put this sacrifice you made into to make sure that tomorrow you have more than you have today? And so for the individual, saving is investment. If you don't give people things that they can hold their savings into, they will live with it. So we need a whole mindset that makes us believe in our tomorrow. Let's talk about the fact that we harvest nature. We are exploiting gold, oil, timber, and so on. Again, if we had the belief that there is going to be a grandchild tomorrow, what are we doing? We'll be able to live in a way in which we don't exhaust all that will be available for their sustenance tomorrow, and rather sometimes leave it a debt to them without asking ourselves, so how are they going to survive? So we need to make sure that we get to the fundamentals of our existence. And I think that there is too much of, I want mine, and let the other person, so even when we are talking, let's say as ECOWAS level, the heads of states meet, and they pass all manner of resolutions. The people who drafted the resolutions are the first to ask, what is the reality in the protocols and resolutions you're putting in front of the heads of states? Because to be able to live with others, you must believe in the saying that you live in a world in which a rising tide lifts all vessels. If you don't believe that leaving your cares to the environment that is being created will make sure that you are also covered. You will not do it. When everybody is asleep, you go into the kitchen and deal with yourself. So we need a whole mindset in which we stop being wards of donors. We need to make sure that we take some of the responsibility for ourselves. Then we'll find that we are already committed, because the enforcement, voluntary enforcement, is what does it. It's not, so the heads of states meet and they sign all these great protocols in a mindset in which says, if only we are already integrated, then ECOWAS becomes an instrument for growth. The issue is, how are we going to be integrated? It is only if we can sink ourselves and believe that we are creating a new world in which we will all will share in the prosperity. If we don't do that, people will chicken out. They'll free ride the enterprise. So we must move from a mindset in which we really don't believe we who crafted it, and don't find a cheap escape and say that, all right, so let's have a total assembly of all of Ghanaians, and then we discuss this, and then we resolve, and everybody will go and we live happily ever after. We, the intellectuals who craft these things, these models, must ask ourselves, what is it that will make our people believe that this thing that we are telling them, we are taking them to, will be indeed the promised land? We have a responsibility to be asking ourselves, how realistic is this model? What is it that is more than a marketing strategy, but something that people can associate with and believe that that is what we all want? That is what we need to do. We, intellectuals, have that responsibility. Don't let's share it. We come up with all manner of reform programs that we have not even thought about. This is what is being done somewhere, so we just sign. Take it to our heads of state. We are the problem. It's not anything. It's not nature. We are the problem. We must ask ourselves. So from here, where are we going? And ask ourselves, why should this be truly a valuable thing to tell your uncle, your mother, your friend, whatever? We must explain why we think this thing will work. If we don't know, let's not waste our time. I think that for me is what it is, something to do. We have a situation in which the spread between the deposit rates and the lending rate is very big. How many of us, but our mindset is that we can get either parliament or the politicians to legislate that it will not happen. I mean, it's a waste of time. If you are going to have the politicians determine, we tried all manner of things with directed credit. So much credit must go into agriculture. So much credit must go into this. We have tried things in which the lending rate is smaller than the cost of funds to banks. Well, then run your own banks. So it is up to us to really solve problems. Let's open it. Call the banks. Why is it that you pay people so little? So little that with inflation, they even are paying, it's almost like susu, and you pay somebody to keep your money for you. Huh? And you want it to do that. So it is important that we get to doing a few things well, rather than having these grand designs that everybody thinks that they will do to us. The challenge is up to us to question our models, to question our recommendations, and to ask ourselves, so if they are not implemented, what's the penalty? Are you going to imprison some SOC for signing something not doing? So it's a useless thing. Our people must believe, but we have the responsibility because we do all the book work. Our people must, when they read the thing, see that yes, I can identify with this. If this thing succeeds, I will also be better off. If we cannot explain that to our people, we're wasting time.
I want to just build on what Dr. Abe has said in terms of questioning the model, and then move on to what I say, holding people accountable. That was the last point with which I left the podium. Many of the times, even intellectuals are not able to question, and because they're not able to question, they're not able to hold anybody responsible or accountable. If there are fantastic designs, and we hear about them, maybe because we don't understand them,
or because we're not part of the decision-making process, if they're not implemented, we're not even able to hold anybody accountable, to do that. So one of the practical things that the question that was asked is, what should we do practically? Practically is that we should hold people accountable. You agreed this. When you agreed, why are you not implementing? But of course, that will only come if we actually understand what we have agreed. So that is why I would think Dr. Abe's model is first. Question the model, then if you understand, ask questions. Be accountable. Professional bodies like this stand a better chance to speak, and they will be heard, because their professional views are going to be listened to. If an individual speaks, it may be difficult to hear. But when a group speaks and they stand by their voice because it has been well considered, well thought about, then they can make statements. I can give you several examples, especially in Nigeria, where professional bodies like the NBA have said, we will not agree to this. And for several reasons, it could be debated. Many times, it could be a sentimental. Many times, these decisions are not well thought out. When professional bodies come together to scrutinize the policy, it will be with empiric evidence to say, we can't take this because these are the implications on our economy, but we need you to act because this is how it is good for us. Those are the kind of things we expect professional bodies like this to do. So we should be more responsible. And then at the individual level, like Abby has said too, is our mindset need to change. I want to talk about this in terms of suspicion. There are times where, even in ECOWAS, when a Nigerian shows up in Côte d'Ivoire, it is an enemy has showed up. They are coming to steal our show. It looks like, these boisterous set of people have come to show that they are the giants of West Africa. We will not allow them. Even when the idea is good. The same thing with Ghana. Somebody was calling me, my cousin from another brother. My cousin from another mother. I said, thank you. But when it comes to argument, it will be like, if Nigeria is saying this, are you sure it is not because of this? Suspicion. And the question is this. Why are we suspecting each other? For very many reasons. So, the mindset, first of all, starts with the individual. We need to open up. We need to see ourselves indeed that we have been balkanized by the powers that be against our wishes. We have been separated into entities that define our identities. And as such, when we see ourselves, instead of opening up and thinking strategically of how we, create the tide that will lift all of us up, we're thinking of how to go into our kitchens. A typical case is the EPA negotiations, when in 2007 the EU gave us the mandate. After December 2007, look, heaven will fall. If you do not sign these EPAs, it is not possible. And this was the case. When countries like Nigeria stood their ground, they say, let heavens fall. We will not sign. By December, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, they did not sign the initial. So this becomes, because the other LDCs are everything but arms, so there was no point for them. But the three non-LDCs, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria, if they spoke with one voice, I'm sure the story may be a little different. But Nigeria didn't sign, and nothing happened. So the question is the suspicion in itself and the fright of the effect on our domestic economy is so much that we're not able to take collective decisions and stand by them. So that is one, so suspicion, I would say. And then finally, in terms of what we should do practically is the grassroots integration. If we write WAEC, I don't know if it's still the same thing. West African Examination Council, the whole of West Africa write the same exam. So my certificate in Nigeria, the certificate in Ghana is seen as the same. Why can't we have more of such things, common fronts, where everything done, our certificates are the same, our passports are the same. Now there's ECOWAS passport, but if I show up in Ghana, somebody shows me and said, you said you were going to stay 2 days. And then, unfortunately, I was counting 2 days from the day of the conference, but I said 2 days. And as I was leaving, the man said, you've overstayed He said, you said 2 days, but you've already overstayed. I said 2 days from the days of the conference. 2 days starting from the day, not the day I entered. So he was counting from the day I entered, and then I stayed by 1 day. And I said, excuse me, I'm in Ghana. I'm not in Europe. How can I overstay by 1 day? I have at least how many months to move freely? So how can you tell, these are the kind of things I'm talking about. But when we have the same passport, it is no, differentiation from any sort. We could be seen at a different level. So practically, there are things we should clamor for. And these things can make it work if they are demanded by the citizens and not by the government or the technocrats. Then finally, on savings mobilization, Dr. Abe has said that our culture, if we look at ourselves, if we project what do we want to do, we need to save for the future. I want to say that when the inflation is so high, that whatever you have saved today, tomorrow means nothing. You see, people begin to look for where to put their money. But if not, why we should hold ourselves accountable that in order to mobilize savings, we can only incentivize. That's one of the words I got from the Central Bank of Nigeria. We don't mandate policies or financial policies. We only incentivize. So as professionals, what we should advise our governments to do is incentivizing, savings products, making the banks see that it is better to serve this kind of people. If you do, you will get this. If you do this, you will get this. And they can fashion out policies or design products that can meet those who really need them, like the SMEs, for instance. It is very costly to finance the poor. It is very expensive to finance SMEs by the banks because the costs, they are very many, but their mobilizations are very small. And so you have higher cost service in them. But when the policymakers or the regulators design, incentives that they say, if you do this level, we will give you this level. If you do this level, we'll give you. Those kind of incentives can help the bank think outside the box on how to reach the small scale group, how to reach the individuals who are very small but who need to still drop the money, and then so that we can mobilize more savings. So I would have to say that we should try and do that incentivizing strategy, and in that way, it possibly increase our mobilization of savings in the long run. I think I could stop with that now. Thank you.
I have a lot of responsibility for why Ghana initiated the ICAG. So once it's been raised, I think it's an important issue and one needs to clarify. I alluded to that difficulty when I said that in the context of the 1 pound to ounce horror, that you had 12 countries that were very independent. They couldn't finance their deficits, as you said, and they had this opportunity of everything, but now that they couldn't export and they had aid to cover them. Now, then you are Nigeria. And Nigeria may be on a rather interesting path about what oil would have done to the rest of the economy when Nigeria runs out of oil. But for now, Nigeria had allowed its cocoa, which used to be exporting cocoa, a lot of other products. So Nigeria is suffering already from a Dutch disease. You are devastating the non-oil sector. You don't care about it. The problem that we were faced with was this. If you are going to lose the little exporters that you've got beyond perhaps cocoa, and cocoa will have to be in raw form, because I had the processors of cocoa coming to my office. I got into this because I opened my big mouth at some meeting, and therefore I was asked to examine the pros and cons of what we're going to do, because the Lome Cotonou Convention was coming to an end. And it was clear that unless we got into some arrangement with Europe, we were going to face immediately in January tariff barriers for things like tuna, for processed cocoa, for the people who are in bananas and so on. And they came to my office, so they made it very clear that there was no way that they were going to be able to pay the tariffs and rebate. The cocoa processors actually told me that if we are going to sit down and make them having to pay the 7% or 9%, whatever duty to Europe, they were going to relocate from Ghana to La Côte d'Ivoire. There was another reality. ECOWAS was formed 4 years before OMWA, but OMWA is a customs union. And the Europeans were negotiating simultaneously with La Côte d'Ivoire under the banner of OMWA and with Ghana literally under the banner of ECOWAS. It was clear that if Ivory Coast could not get its way to get a consensus in the framework of ECOWAS, Ivory Coast would sign on the basis of being an UNWA state. Ghana was going to be left alone out there because Nigeria didn't care, because Nigeria had the resources that it needed. And Nigeria has not been worried about the lack of competitiveness of the non-oil sector. So yeah, Nigeria could absorb all those shocks and nothing will happen. I don't know if Ghana would have been able to survive without oil and without the exporters like bananas and other things. We have fought very hard to help quotas out there. So it's a question of everybody trying to second guess. I saw my country under threat. The issue about ECOWAS when we're talking about Europe is Nigeria willing to play Germany? Is Nigeria willing to really bankroll? And look at what the Germans are now doing to the Greeks. You know, so there's a certain reality in life when you run out of, and all these EBAs, if they're going to drop and be on their own, then Nigeria should be ready to make sure that in the interim, as we also get more oil and so will join, but that in the interim, somebody is going to have to bankroll the system. And the question then is, will Nigerians find that they do have the mindset that the future matters, and therefore their sacrifices today will lead to a better tomorrow for all of us? These are the realistic issues that have to be faced. And when we also did this, I realized that in the short run, there could be a problem for urban revenues, there could be a problem for Ghanaian enterprises. So what I did was to use the technicality to buy 5 years for Ghana. Would you believe that the IEPA is essentially being implemented, but which tariff has been reduced? Nothing. I built into the Ghanaian market access offer. I used the fact that I, working in the economic recovery program period, had been accused by all manner of people of having presided over excessive trade liberalization. So we had a number of items that already had been zero. The technical presentation was that we were liberalizing, we were reducing 0 to 0 for 5 years. And we bought the Europeans accepted that we were reducing, even though we're staying at the zeros. We invite this batch in, reduce it to 0. It was already at 0. So the bottom. So Ghana, because of the zero tariffs already in existence, Ghana 5 years, ending 2013, and we've done nothing to look at the competitiveness, because the 5 years were to be used, in my view, to make sure that we raise the international competitiveness of Ghanaian enterprises. We've done nothing. We've kept the ideological debates going, and next year we'll reach the crunch. Then we'll know whether nothing happens. And let me say this last one. If we don't deal with the competitiveness, the Asians will in a case leap over your barriers and I'll compete you. Watch what will happen. And I'm waiting for the ideologues to begin to say whether we should raise tariffs against Chinese exports to Ghana. I thank you. We are waiting to see that.
At this point, I'll ask our chairman to wrap up so that we can go for our tea break.
To be honest, colleagues, I think this is the most difficult and challenging position I've ever been, to be in the midst of such wonderful presenters. And I think the material is well laid out. For Dr. Abe and my colleague Daniels, I think we are so grateful for you and your delivery. I think in conclusion, I wouldn't try to summarize the issues at all, to be honest with you. I'm not going to try that. I will just go straight to the conclusion. And the conclusion is basically based on what Prof. also tried to lecture us on, because for me it was a complete lecture, taking it from where we are through the history in Nairobi, coming with all the multinationals and the donor community, and asking the question, so what next? What we all have to take in mind is, as professionals, I think I'll borrow from my colleague Daniels, we will have to be assertive and question the models that we are used to. I think we are all becoming too theoretical, and we should face the facts. And for Doc, I think ECOWAS will listen to you, and we will look at what will happen in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are behind time, so our tea break will be for 15 minutes.